Too many things open on my desktop. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the National Constitution Center's online classes. I am Jenna Karras. I am the Director of Learning and Engagement, and I am your substitute moderator for today. So I'm happy to be here with you. And also joining us is a face that you will recognize, one of our top scholars here at the NCC, Tom Donnelly. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Jenna, great to be here with you.
So exciting. So today's topic is kind of finishing off our kind of 3-week stint of First Amendment February. So we did speech and press, we did the religion clauses, and now we're going to dive into assembly and petition. So it's going to be a really exciting topic today. So here are some of the big questions that we're going to be focusing on in class today as we explore assembly and petition. But before we dive into that specific topic, I thought we'd take a beat and just kind of recap that First Amendment and how they all work together, because these could seem like different topics, but they all do really kind of work together, right, Tom?
Yeah, exactly. So it's this important bundle of rights that sometimes it can be tough to figure out, why are these all there in the same spot? And the way we look at it is, broadly speaking, all of these rights are all connected with our broader right of conscience, the freedom of conscience. And so, with religion, we have a freedom to believe or not as we wish. With free speech, we can speak our minds. With a press, we can print and show the world what we believe. And with assembly and petition, those are two other tools in our First Amendment toolkit. With the freedom of assembly, we can join together with other people. And with the right to petition, we can basically write out the things that are bothering us that our government's doing, sign our name to it, maybe get other people to sign to and send it to the government to give them a sense of our views. And so all of these things together, in the end, going to our freedom to believe or not as we wish.
That's so powerful and such a really great way to look at it, to kind of frame. And once you have that framing, you understand why they are all together. All right, so let's start, like you always do, with the words of the Constitution. Tom, do you want to read it this time? I read it last time.
Oh, absolutely. So the key words here are: Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, this text, I think the best way to read this text, especially faithfully with the text and history of the First Amendment itself, is it's two distinct rights. It's the right to assemble and the right to petition. Each of them, again, are different expressive acts. So with the freedom of assembly, it's protecting our right to gather together with others in groups. So that could be part of a political meeting, part of a religious gathering, maybe we're worshiping together, a street protest or a parade, but it's this idea of we're doing something together. And so that's the freedom of assembly. We'll talk about sort of its core as a constitutional protection and its history in a little bit. The other key right here is the right to petition. So this goes to our right to join together with others to share our collective views with the government. It's often going to be a way in which we're going to set down in writing, perhaps on a piece of paper, some of the problems we see with what the government's doing, and also often suggesting ways of fixing them. So a petition really is, it's a sheet of paper, again, with a complaint on the top, names at the bottom, and we send it to the government. And the government is supposed to look at it and take it into account. It's a way of communicating our public sentiments, often with other people, to the government.
Yeah, so thank you for reiterating that and clearing that up. It is two separate rights, although they are sometimes taken together and do intermingle. They are definitely two separate rights and two distinct rights. And thanks for explaining the difference between those. So before we get into this, each separate the separate cases of assembly and petition, can you tell us why these rights would have been so top of mind for the founding generation? Kind of where were they coming from? What was their experience with assembly and petition?
Yeah, absolutely. These are things that grew out of their own experiences. In part, both the assembly right and the petition right are growing out of the English constitutional tradition that they're inheriting. So these are rights that you would find in canonical texts for the British people. For instance, like the English Bill of Rights. And so as the American colonists became the American people, with them, they really took with them many of these rights that they had as Englishmen, as English people under the English Empire. And so both of those rights being important there. But more broadly, as we talk about American history, these rights end up becoming so important to political dissenters. And so these are people who are without power, without voice, often without a vote. African Americans, women, Native Americans, people who don't have other means of political power do have the means of joining together, gathering together as an expressive act, and also of petitioning their government.
And I think one of my favorite stories to tell, because I was born and raised here in Pennsylvania, is William Penn, because he really was an example of somebody who was in that religious minority group and kind of stood up for his rights.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, let's begin with the right of assembly. And it's really, William Penn is a great place to start. So if you're James Madison, you're the first Congress putting together the First Amendment. When you're thinking of the right of assembly and the right of religious freedom together, the first person that's going to come to mind is probably going to be William Penn and his trial in the 1670s. And so who's William Penn? Well, he's the Penn of Pennsylvania, but he was a Quaker in England. The Quakers themselves were a religious minority. They were a religious dissenting group, in many ways a thorn in the side of the king. William Penn really first among them. And so William Penn, what is it? What's the key episode that would have been in mind for Madison and the framers of the First Amendment? Well, let's back up. England had an official national church, the Church of England, headed by the king. In order to establish, as part of this established church, they also had a law on the books that said, if you're going to get together with 5 or more people to worship, you better be worshiping the Church of England and not some other religious group. So this is effectively a law that's banning religious gatherings by religious dissenters. And so William Penn looked at this law. He said, this is nonsense. This is ridiculous. This violates core rights of mine as an English subject. And part of that is some sort of religious liberty, some sort of freedom of conscience. And so I don't care what this law says. I'm going to gather together with my fellow Quakers in a Quaker meeting. And so here we have William Penn. We have a clear law on the books. William Penn is clearly violating that law. He's arrested. He's put on trial. And despite the fact that he has violated the law, the jury decides, no, we are not going to find William Penn guilty. And so this is a jury standing up to the king, standing up to a judge who's very angry about it, really standing up to the law that was on the books, and instead saying, no, this violates some deeper right that we have. And so here, the judge then says, well, that's okay. Jurors, you want to rule that way? Well, I'm going to take away your food. I'm going to throw you in jail and make you think a little bit about what you just did. And by the way, you really should convict William Penn here. And then as the jurors are being taken away, William Penn screams out to them, you are Englishmen, mind your privilege, give not away your right. And so this ends up being this powerful example where we can see how 2 key rights in the First Amendment work together, the right to religious worship, but also the right to assemble. Because the right to assemble here is this right to have this religious gathering in defiance of the crown, in defiance of the law, in defiance of this judge. And so this was a really powerful example for Madison and the framers.
Yeah, and it's a great example of, again, how those different First Amendment freedoms are working together. Because in order to, practice your religion, you need to assemble, and sort of having all of those kind of pieces working together. Colin and Warren both pointed out that was kind of jury nullification. This is not a class on jury nullification, but good job, guys. That's thank you for doing that. Okay, so that's kind of where that freedom of assembly came from, and why it was so important for them to kind of include this when they did eventually write that Bill of Rights into our Constitution. So what exactly does freedom of assembly entail? Is it just our right to get together, or is there broader protections underneath that kind of umbrella of freedom of assembly?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, for us today, when we think of the freedom of assembly, the first things that probably come to mind are political meetings, parades, protests. For the founding generation, they would have also thought, we just saw the William Penn example, religious gatherings, but also meeting in convention. That would be another thing that would have been important for the founding generation. But it's really this freedom that's giving us, it's a freedom to gather together with like-minded people. It's different than some of the other rights in the First Amendment in that it requires more than one person.
You can't do it by yourself.
Yeah, exactly. You can't assemble just by yourself. That's just me sitting in my house by myself. But no, you have to gather together with others. And through this act of assembly, there's some expressive act that's powerful and different. But, the freedom of assembly is also protecting the Supreme Court said, a broader right of association. And so what this can go to is often to have a really great assembly. Think of the March on Washington. What has to happen before that happens? It's often you have to have groups come together. You have to have planning ahead of time and things like that. And so all of those acts of coordination are broadly protected by the freedom of assembly. But the way to think of assembly, though, and this is the way I always like to think of it, is there is something distinct about it. the act of assembling itself, it is the expressive act. So you may not be great with words. You may not be able to, you may not be a great speaker. You may not have your own printing press. But what the freedom of assembly allows is for if you can inspire other people to get together with you to protest, to parade, that very act, despite not having some of those other aspects, the very act of assembling together with our bodies becomes a powerful statement.
Yeah, and I think that's also good to remember that way. I hope I'm going to say this right. If you aren't a printer or you aren't a writer or a good speaker, but you want to still show your support from the cause by attending those assemblies where those people are speaking, kind of helps to add to that. Like, you are expressing yourself and adding to that cause that you believe in, even if you're not a public speaker or a writer or a printer. So I think that's a really important avenue to think about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the big idea here, and I love this, you have it on the screen here, Jenna, is that, this right of assembly is protecting dissenters and unpopular groups for a lot of, they're often the groups that are taking advantage of this right of assembly: religious minorities, people who have unpopular opinions, labor activists, civil rights groups, often political outsiders who are trying to push for a vision of America that they believe is going to make it better, that's going to build a more perfect union.
Yeah. And let's look at some of those. So let's start with kind of that founding generation, the Democratic Republican societies, and then kind of tick through some other examples from history.
Yeah. So right at the beginning of America under the Constitution, we have a group of political dissenters. So we have John Adams as president. It's the Adams administration, but there are Americans who disagree with John Adams's policies. And so they form these Democratic Republican societies that become key bodies that are trying to hold the government accountable to their opinions. They believe that the Adams administration has deviated from the Constitution and from the principles of the revolution. And so they're there as political dissenters at the beginning, speaking back at the president. These societies are associated with people like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, that early political opposition where we're already beginning in the very early republic to have two parties pitted against one another in our political system. But, I think in many ways, one of the most powerful examples of the freedom of assembly is a group that we may not think of as unpopular today. And that's the group of abolitionists who pushed to abolish slavery. And so today we look at these are the constitutional heroes in our story. What is the great, first sin of America? It's the institution of slavery. And this is the group, especially as we get into the 1800s, that's pushing to end that institution, that's arguing that this institution runs against the very principles of the American Revolution, the principles of the Declaration of Independence, what's best about America. But what's notable is that in the early 1800s, these abolitionists and anti-slavery groups were unbelievably unpopular. And not just in the South, not just among the slaveholders, but also among the many members of the North, especially members of the political establishment. And so this is a group that's just broadly unpopular. Why are they unpopular? Well, they're being attacked by political leaders across the spectrum, again, North and South, for being a bunch of troublemakers. They're sowing discord. There's a fear that we might have, ultimately, and we did, a civil war over this issue. And so there's an idea that the abolitionists are just stoking this anger and frustration and that it's going to lead to violence. And so we see state after state take action against the abolitionists, especially in the South. And so we see laws on the books that ban abolitionist speech, abolitionist printing, abolitionist preaching, but also abolitionist assemblies. And what's the great wrong the abolitionists are doing here? It's their message. Their message is seen to be too hot. It's too dangerous. And we need to suppress it. But it's even worse than that, Jenna. It's not only the laws on the books, but when those laws don't work, what do we see community and political leaders do? We see them join together with their fellow citizens in mobs. And they create there's mob violence against abolitionists and anti-slavery groups again throughout the country. So when the law doesn't work, they turn to violence. This could lead to violence and even to murder, with the classic example being the 1837 murder of Elijah Lovejoy. He was an abolitionist printer, not down south, but in Illinois. He was murdered in the land of Lincoln because he was spreading an abolitionist message. What we know is that despite this violence, despite even murder at times, the abolitionists and anti-slavery activists, they continued to meet, they continued to preach, they continued to print, they continued to speak, and ultimately, after a bloody civil war, we would finally end slavery and set America on a better constitutional foundation.
Yeah, thank you for making that point, Tom, and reminding us that, yeah, obviously abolition is something that we all agree today needed to happen and was important and a good cause, but that wasn't always the case. And that's why it is important to protect those, unpopular opinions, or sometimes diverse or opposing opinions. I saw Louis put a question in the Q&A. So yeah, the freedom of assembly does protect all sorts of different points of view, even unpopular ones. And for that very reason, that's so important.
Yeah.
So moving on, let's talk about African American conventions.
Yeah, this is another powerful example of the freedom of assembly. So these are groups of African Americans that meet before, during, and after the Civil War. And what they do is they join together and they're debating, they're conversing, they're deliberating. What they're trying to do is come up with, ideas of how America needs to change in order to ensure true freedom and equality for the African American community. And this ends up being a really, powerful group of voices that would especially shape the vision of America that would happen after the Civil War. So these conventions are meeting, and what they do is they often, we see the fusion of assembly and petition. They'll meet with one another, they'll come up with ideas, they'll say, this is what the government's doing wrong, this is what the Constitution is doing right and doing wrong, and this is what needs to change. These are the rights that are essential to us. They put them in a petition, they'd sign it, they'd sign their names to it, they'd send them off to Congress. And we'd even see, as we get again into towards the end of the Civil War and into Reconstruction, we would see key senators like Senator Charles Sumner, the abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, take these petitions from these African American assemblies, present them to Congress to ensure that those ideas are taken into account, and giving them to the Joint Committee on Reconstruction. That was the committee of Congress that was tasked with coming up with the laws and even the constitutional amendments that were necessary after the Civil War to ensure a genuine second American founding for the entire nation, and also a new birth of freedom, especially for African Americans.
I love that. I love that sort of like relay. It's assembly, and then we hand over the petition and bring that to Congress. All right, another group that really used the power of assembly in their favor in a really effective way was the suffragists.
Yeah, and here we see multiple generations of suffragists turning to the right of assembly. And so here, the first example we could look at is from 1848, the famous example of the Seneca Falls Convention. This is a group of women and men who are interested in advancing a vision of equality between men and women. So this is at work, at home, but also at the ballot box. And so they meet together in convention and they come up with one of the most famous documents in American history, the Declaration of Sentiments. And so here, this document, which is authored primarily by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, it takes the model of the Declaration of Independence. And whereas the Declaration of Independence was complaining about all of the terrible things that King George III and England had done to the colonies, the Seneca Falls Convention says, no, what we're going to do is we're going to have a declaration of all of the wrongs that have been done to women and what's going to be necessary to ensure genuine equality between the sexes in the United States. So it's this powerful way in which they're using a convention to then draft this Declaration of Sentiments, which is effectively a petition, but also drawing on some of the deepest principles of the American Revolution and the American founding. But if you flash forward ahead then to the 20th century, the early 20th century, we see another generation of women also using assembly rights in a different way. So here we're looking at the context. It's 1916. Woodrow Wilson has just been reelected. Woodrow Wilson is a bit of a waffler on the issue of women's suffrage. And so we have Alice Paul and members of the National Women's Party deciding how can we convince Woodrow Wilson to take up the suffragist cause, to really fight for the women's right to vote. They decide what we're going to do is we're going to picket the White House. We're going to protest in front of the White House. And, I used to live in Washington, D.C. This may not seem like all that radical an act. Every cause under the sun seems to picket in front of the White House. But as far as I know, these women were the first ones to do it. So it was a radical act of defiance. And if you look at the arguments they're presenting, they're pretty cool. I mean, they're relying on many key principles of the American Revolution, things like popular sovereignty, rule by we the people, rule by the consent of the governed. They're really echoing a lot of arguments that sort of, again, go all the way back to the American Revolution. For a while, these picketers are just left alone. President Wilson would even sort of wave to them as he'd go by. But eventually, the United States enters World War I. Things change. And they decide finally that, no, we don't want these picketers in front of the White House in the middle of a war. So they begin arresting the women who are protesting in front of the White House. These women aren't treated well when they are arrested, but the women kept coming. Public opinion shifted. Eventually, Woodrow Wilson would change his mind, support women's suffrage, and eventually we would write that protection into the Constitution with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. What's good about this example, too, though, is it's a reminder of how constitutional change happens, sometimes how constitutional amendments happen. Where here we have, in many ways, the most radical voices deciding to pick at the White House, taking the most radical action, the most visible action. At the same time, they're working in coordination with other parts of the women's suffrage movement. Some people are behind the scenes lobbying in Congress. Many activists are just active state by state, trying to change state voting laws to allow women to vote in more and more elections throughout the country. And so we see constitutional change requires broad consensus, it requires broad action, but the freedom of assembly is often at the very core of those actions that are taken to push for constitutional change.
Yeah, like they did have that multi-pronged approach, which was so effective for them, but like having kind of these women very visible, not only can you not ignore us, we're right here in front of the president's house, but we're also not going to go away. We're not going to give up. These are, it was really a very powerful sort of statement from those women.
Absolutely.
All right, so Colin asks, how was this applied in the first few years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment to the states? So I think this is a good time to take a beat and talk about incorporation.
Yeah, so the First Amendment, like the rest of the Bill of Rights, when it's first ratified, it only applies to the national government. It would take two separate things for us to actually get it to apply to state laws and actions and local laws and actions. The first is the ratification of the 14th Amendment. So this happens after the Civil War. In 1868, we ratify the 14th Amendment. And part of the 14th Amendment is a broad promise of freedom. So over my shoulder, I have, I don't know if you can say, John Bingham's over there. He's the primary author of the 14th Amendment. And part of his vision with the 14th Amendment is we want all of those broad protections that you see in the Bill of Rights, we want them to apply to state and local governments. Because one of the lessons of American history is not only should we be concerned about abuses by the national government, but we learn, especially from the pre-Civil War South and the Civil War itself, is that sometimes the states are the problem. And so with the 14th Amendment, there's a vision of extending these protections like the freedom of assembly to state laws, to local laws. And finally, with decisions by the United States Supreme Court in the 20th century, that vision becomes a reality. In the context of the freedom of assembly, it's a case called DeJong versus Oregon in 1937. The broader vision here, the lawyerly word for this is incorporation. We're incorporating that freedom of assembly against the states. But the broader version, if you don't get tripped up in jargon, is that incorporation is really making the Bill of Rights, including things like the freedom of assembly, a charter of national freedom, a set of freedoms that's going to apply just as much to the national government as it does to the states, as it does to local governments, because all governments can abuse our rights.
Yeah, that's so good and very helpful to know that we can have that protection at all levels of government. All right, so Colin also points out that, sometimes we learn that these First Amendment freedoms aren't completely absolute. There are restrictions on the freedom of assembly, and what would that look like? How does the court kind of interpret this, like through the years?
Yeah, so if we look, especially looking at freedom of assembly today, what sort of live issues might you see? Well, again, the classic examples would be things like protests and parades. Well, the Supreme Court has said over time, like every other right, that freedom of assembly is not absolute. And so what they permit the governments to do is to enact what are called reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. So what that sets on the government, so take something like a parade. What a time, place, and manner restriction in that context is, it's saying, if you're a government, you can require a permit before someone has a parade. Because, you want to be able to coordinate. If you have to shut down a street, you want to make sure you don't have two parades happening at the same time. There are just ways in which we are able to maintain order, even as we allow people to reasonably express their views. The key part of this, though, is that it really has to be neutral. The government you can't have rules that are going to allow you to give a permit to a group you like and deny a permit to a group you don't like. And so the Supreme Court's going to look at these restrictions and really make sure that there's not discretion, that the government officials can't really impose their own vision of which message is good and which message is bad. Another classic example here would be, it's okay for, a town to pass a law that says you can't ride in the streets and make a ton of noise with like a giant bullhorn in the middle of the night, because we want people to sleep. We do actually care about the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So we're going to give you a lot of tools to say a lot of things, even really unpopular things that absolutely push the limit. but there are certain ways in which the government can pass neutral regulations to regulate the time, place, and manner of doing things in order just to sort of keep some general order.
Yeah, that's really helpful to understand. I shared in the last class an example of, we have a lot of special events here at the center, which we do outdoors because we're right there on Independence Mall. And sometimes I like to shut down the street in front of our building so I can have, tents and activities and things like that. And I've often gotten permission to shut down the street on the weekends, but the city of Philadelphia has told me, no, I can't shut down the street during the week because people are going to work. They would have to reroute the buses. It would cause too much disturbance to just the general flow of so I think that's a really great example of a time, place, and manner restriction. But it's important to remember that wasn't because of my event or me or the Constitution Center. That was a general thing that they would have said to anybody. So I think the point I think you're making, Tom, is that you can have rules, but the same rules have to apply to everybody. You can't pick and choose which groups you say yes or no to based on the content of what they're saying. It's just, like you said, time, place, and manner.
Exactly. Even if the city of Philadelphia really dislikes the Constitution, which it doesn't, but even if it did, it can't discriminate against the Constitution Center.
Exactly. All right. So we have about 5 minutes to look at the right of petition. So tell us, what is the right of petition, and then we'll do the same thing. We'll go through some really historic examples of the right to petition through U.S. history.
Yeah, so the right to petition, it's the right to sort of share our collective views with the government. So we're highlighting things we don't like, maybe suggesting some solutions, some ways to make things better. And this is just something that's sort of written in the American DNA. It, again, goes back to our experience as colonists. So, the right to petition within the English tradition goes all the way back to Magna Carta, all the way back to the English Bill of Rights. It's a really deeply embedded part of the rights of an English person. And so we have it there. We see it also absolutely at the beginning in the American Revolution itself. And so the classic example, what did we do? Things were really fraying between the colonists and the king. What did we decide to do? John Dickinson helped author the Olive Branch Petition to sort of write to the king, say what's going on, say what's bothering us, and asking, please improve the conditions. We don't want to break with you, but it's our duty to be able to use our petition right. It's our right and our duty to tell you what's going wrong. Or even just look at the Declaration of Independence itself. What is one of the really big complaints that the Americans have as they're declaring independence? It's the king, you didn't listen. All of this stuff's happened, and we petitioned you, we've implored you over and over again. We've used our right to petition, we've expressed our grievances, and you've done nothing. That's one of the things that proves you're a tyrant. You don't listen to the complaints of your people and try to make things better. So again, right there at the American Revolution, we see some key examples. But again, as we go into the rest of American history, we see the right to petition is really, really important for those pushing for political and constitutional change. They may have unpopular ideas, and it's connected in many of our examples here to the issue of slavery. The right to petition becomes really, really important to a range of anti-slavery voices. That begins all the way at the beginning of America with this great figure, Prince Hall. So Prince Hall is a free African-American in Boston in the 1770s. He's active in the African-American community there. He actually petitions on a variety of issues. He's really, really interested in trying to make both Boston and Massachusetts better. And as part of his activities, he decides to put together a petition to the Massachusetts government on behalf of 7 African-Americans. And he's saying, Massachusetts, abolish slavery. Abolish slavery. This is inconsistent with natural rights. And then ultimately, after the Declaration of Independence, he has a petition to end slavery in 1777, where he says, not only is this against natural law, it's also against the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Massachusetts, you must get rid of slavery. You must ensure that African Americans are free. And ultimately, in 1783, the Supreme Court, the highest court in Massachusetts, declares slavery unconstitutional. So we see the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts in 1783, and many of the arguments in that opinion echo what we saw people like Prince Hall saying, which is, again, slavery. It's inconsistent with natural law, inconsistent with the Declaration of Independence and its promise of freedom and equality, and it's also inconsistent with the Massachusetts Constitution. So that's Prince Hall, on one hand, a voice that we know today, thankfully, because many people tell his story, but was a forgotten story for a long time. But on the other hand, we see famous Americans, but in many ways, the most famous American of the day, also using the petition right, and that's Benjamin Franklin. So we have the Constitution's ratified, we have our first Congress, and Benjamin Franklin becomes the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. And in 1790, just as that first Congress is getting going, what does Franklin do? He and the Abolition Society, they send a petition to Congress, basically saying exactly what Prince Hall said, saying the institution of slavery is contrary to the American character. It's contrary to our character as an American people. And because of that, Congress, you must act against slavery. And so Benjamin Franklin here, teeing up the issue of slavery before the first Congress, it leads to a lot of anger, especially among the pro-slavery voices in Congress. Ultimately, Congress sets aside the petition. Dr. Franklin dies 2 months later. So this is really his last big public act. But again, this reminds us of two really big things. I guess three really big things. One, the right to petitions is absolutely essential to the anti-slavery cause. And then the other really big thing is that these arguments against slavery are there from the absolute beginning. So Prince Hall in 1777, Benjamin Franklin, the Abolition Society with the Quakers in 1790. And then the third thing here that's really important is it's a reminder that, and not just when it comes to the institution of slavery, but so many other arguments about constitutional change throughout American history, we see constitutional reformers drawing on our deepest principles, whether it's the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, to push for change. The Declaration becomes, both for Prince Hall and Benjamin Franklin, a way to look at their respective governments and say, look, what you are doing is inconsistent with our most core values. You must change.
Yeah, I love that kind of, we modeled it from the very beginning with the declaration of, this is what listing that petition, and kind of the fact that, Americans throughout history have kind of followed that example. You pointed out Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Declaration of Sentiments, Prince Hall, again, just following that example of the Declaration. Even Martin Luther King, I know in his speech on Washington, quoted that document. So it's really such a great example to follow. Well, I think we are pretty much out of time. Is there anything you want to end on, or anything we didn't get to before we wrap up, Tom?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just a reminder. Those are good stories to end on, because again, it's a reminder that both assembly and petition are just key. They're just key tools for those who are expressing unpopular ideas. It could be someone who has less political power, like Prince Hall. It could be, one of the most powerful and famous Americans, like Benjamin Franklin. But both of them, when expressing this idea that was so unpopular at the time, found the petition right a key way to both. I think what's nice about the petition right is it forces you to, in a concrete way, crystallize your ideas. Both what you think is wrong and what you think should be different, set them to paper and then send them to the government. And so this is before we had opinion polling or anything like this. This was a way, for a very direct way, for citizens, whether you're as famous as Franklin or having less power like a Prince Hall, to ensure that your government can see what you're thinking.
That's really great. And thank you for that reminder. It's so good to remember that. So thank you, Tom. Thank you for answering all of our questions, my questions, and the questions from the chat. Students, thank you for joining us. We do have our Friday session with Zach Greenberg, and then next week we're doing 14th Amendment and incorporation. So a little bit more about how these First Amendment rights got incorporated. So thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.